welcome. This is our third webinar in our Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy webinar series. So for those of you who are not part of the Leadership Academy, I will be sharing a little bit about that program and what that's all about here in just a minute. But before we do that, I just want to do some quick introductions. I'll introduce myself and just a little bit about SAFE Project and what brought us here today. My name is Hannah Fitzpatrick. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Assistant Director of our Safe Campuses Initiative, and I oversee all of our student development programs. So that does include our National Internship Program, as well as our Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy. SAFE Project is a national nonprofit organization. We do a lot of things. We have 4 main initiatives: safe communities, safe veterans, safe workplaces, and safe campuses. I would really encourage you to take a look at our website if you're not terribly familiar with the work that we do, just so you can kind of see all what's happening in all 4 of those different initiatives. Tonight, we are here on behalf of our Safe Campuses initiative. And part of our Safe Campuses initiative, our mission is really to normalize recovery on campuses across the nation. And we do that through a variety of ways. We do that through some technical assistance and training for staff and administrators. And we also train student leaders across the country through our Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy program. And what that program is it's an academic year-long fellowship program for students in recovery as well as recovery allies. And our Leadership Academy students work on a project on their campus throughout the year that's going to impact collegiate recovery in some way. They also attend some really awesome events that we host, and we also provide a scholarship for them to attend. And then they receive mentorship from some peers and also some professionals. And then they also come to these really awesome webinars. So thank you to all of our Leadership Academy students who are here tonight. If you all want to just go ahead and put your name and where you're from, I think it would be really cool just to share out a little bit about what brought you here to this webinar. And then before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Matt, to introduce himself.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, my name is Matt Patterson. I use he, him pronouns. I am the student voice liaison for SAFE Project. I'm a graduate of last year's Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy cohort. I'm also a person in long-term recovery and a Master of Social Work student at Florida Atlantic University, and I graduate in like 1 month. So yes. I'll be moderating tonight's Zoom panel. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, just go ahead and use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Load your question up into there, and then at the end, I'll go ahead and ask your questions for you, and we'll get some responses. So really looking forward to tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And that was Matt's sly way of saying, send me a graduation present. Oh, man. All right. Well, thanks, Matt. We're going to go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to do a quick introduction of my colleague, Tracy. So Tracy is actually one of our very own. A lot of times we do bring in people who are not associated with SAFE Project to host these webinars, but we're really, really fortunate to have someone on our team who has such wonderful subject matter expertise on the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight. And I'm really excited for us to just get right into it. So Tracy, I'll pass it over to you.
Hey everyone. So thanks so much, Hannah and Matt. My name is Tracy Stefik. I'm the Senior Director for our Safe Communities portfolio at SAFE Project. Before I do jump into our topic, I wanted to give you all a little bit of background on how I came to SAFE and why this topic in particular, it hits real close to home for me. I actually have a master's in public administration and MPA. I spent a lot of my early career doing direct services, so primarily with low and moderate income people, those that are unhoused, involved in domestic violence situations, as well as those that might have been child welfare involved, and so forth. And so that experience for me really grew into broader strategic projects that are across human services, health and human services programs as a whole. So a lot of times in government, there's programs are very, very siloed, and there's competing priorities and different funding streams that they operate under. And so really bringing together like housing, for example, with financial assistance programs, with child welfare, all together to strategically work on projects. I've also done a lot of community work with coalitions, and I've worked at a national level with communities through an association as well, where we specifically worked with elected officials on early childhood policy. And so that kind of brought me here to where I am at SAFE, working with communities on a national level that are impacted by substance use disorders. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today about public policy making. I've just spent my entire career like just advocating for and doing things professionally that I truly believe in. So I hope I can inspire you today to do a little bit of that as well. So to kick it off, I want to just start very high level. What is policy? And so policies are a set of rules or guidelines that outline what an organization is going to do. This might be either proposed or already adopted policy. And this is typically done in order to move towards or achieve an identified goal. And so there's policy kind of all around us. So first, for you all on campus, you're going to have some campus policies that are impacting you day to day. Typically, these are recommended through a student governance structure on your campuses. But also another way that policies might impact you is if you work. You might be impacted by hiring policies or HR policies through your company or your business. And then there's public policy, is typically the way that it's referred to. And this is what's at the federal, the state, and the local level. And actually, all of these things can impact you on your campus as well. Now, I have some examples on there of different federal, state, and local policy decisions that might be impacting you on campus, as well as different campus policies, for example. But really what I want to say here is that not all policies are going to be written down. And I do want to emphasize that at some point in your life, you might step into a space where you come across a policy that is not written down, that is a policy that's more assumed or unspoken. So a good example of this is that there's some unwritten rule. It's sort of like a social norm to some degree that you don't run against an active senator who's running for re-election. So that's kind of an example of something that might not be written down, but would be something that is assumed. And so it's really important to just be aware of the different policies that are out there and how they might impact you in your life. One, because you don't want to sort of step into a political faux pas, but also because if at any point in your life you are advocating for any type of policy change, it's just really important to know what's already in existence, what the policy is, and be well versed in that, because that allows you to have better conversations around policy. If you already know what the policy is, it's a lot of times people use policy to tell you no. And if you already know what that policy is, it's much easier to sort of navigate those situations. So I'm going to move on here. Yeah, so here you have examples of different policies that might impact you. So there are state budget decisions that are made. This impacts some things that happen on campus as far as affordability goes and funding as well. If you're a veteran student, the federal government administers those benefits, and there's eligibility requirements for that. So ultimately those trickle down. And so also, like, there's often state consumer protection policies as well for student loans. And then of course, what you're seeing on campus would be things like policies that are surrounding drug and alcohol use, and then as well as the acceptable use of information technology. So if you're using a computer or you're logging into some software program that's connected to your school, then that's another type of policy that's out there that's impacting you on a day-to-day. So who creates public policy? Who does this? And so a lot of times if we're talking about a campus or we're talking about a business, those are organizations that are going to create their own policy. Sometimes that trickles down from federal and state or local laws as well that might impact policy. But for the purpose of tonight's webinar, I'm going to be talking specifically about public policy. And so this is for the government or the public sector. And really policy is created in collaboration with a bunch of people with different vested interests. So this might be other nonprofits, people that are directly impacted, and community advocates, as well as special interest groups. And so I wanted to give you an example kind of each of those. So really like a special interest group, for example, just thinking of, so Safe Project is a national nonprofit. There's other national nonprofits as well that are out there. Special interest groups might be like the Human Rights Campaign. I know a lot of you might be familiar with that, the ACLU, the NRA. There's also associations or trade organizations that are out there as well. So American Medical Association is a good example. There's also think tanks out there. So this is like Brookings and Pew, and then RAND, or the Center for American Progress. And then there's philanthropy, different foundations as well that often will set different priorities for what they choose to, what their public policy agenda is going to be and what they choose to advocate on. But the reason why that all of these people sort of come together is because there's not, we cannot expect one person, one political figurehead, like a congressperson or a governor, to know absolutely everything about every issue. So there's a lot of complexities when it comes to the criminal justice system, and there's a lot of complexities when it comes to like in the environment. And so it'd be impossible for everyone to understand and know all of those different nuances. So it is important when an issue comes up that all of these groups sort of come together and really advocate for and educate people that are setting public policy on these issues with their interest. So also, who creates, do policies are always going to do what they intend? And so the truth is no, they don't always do what we intend them to do. Not a lot of policies do work in theory, but sometimes when they're put to practice, they're not actually implemented in the way that they were intended to. The other thing I want to say here is that while not all policies are mirroring communities effectively. And even though some policies were intended to be well-meaning and sometimes not, because of the result of some oppressive systems that we have, we've historically left out many marginalized populations from the policy shaping and decision-making process. So this is really important, I think, to say that if you're ever in a place where you are setting policy or advocating for policy, having all people represented at the table is really, really critical component of the work as we kind of move forward. I wanted to share with you today a little bit of the public policy process at a very high level. And so this basically at a very high level, the Congress is given, the Constitution gives the federal government powers. Some of these powers are actually shared at the state level or shared with the states. And then the states have some powers that the federal government, if it's not written in the Constitution, the federal government has. And then that also trickles down to the local level. And so at the local level, it just really varies. Every state is different, as you know, from state to state, the laws are different. Same thing with local governments and the structures. So your local government in particular is going to be like your municipality, a county, or a city, as an example. So this is sort of how the public policy process happens at all levels of government for the most part, with some nuances. So I just want to dig into kind of each of the process as it pertains to this model here. And I want to also say that this looks like a really neat process. But the truth is that this gets really, really messy. It looks really pretty and simplified on paper, but it gets messy because politics becomes involved, relationships get involved, strategy, people's attitudes and belief systems. And so that all influences this process ultimately. So talking here about this first stage, when you're creating public policy, this is the problem identification stage. And this is really where we sort of identify that there is a need for something to change. It's been brought to our attention. It's been brought to the attention of the government. And that is typically done by people like you, the public, as well as activists in the space. It could also be done by practitioners that work in the field, or even sometimes it's media and journalism as well. And so a lot of what's done during this time is like reports that are done, data is looked at, as well as different policy briefs as well, that sort of provides evidence on the issue. Once that kind of gets the attention to get to a public agenda, a public policy agenda, on the agenda itself, we go into the policy formulation stage and also the adoption stage. So most of what happens here is specifically when the policy ideas are created. So we think a little bit about what the current policy goals are, and then really work to identify what the alternative solutions might be. And so again, people are imperfect. And so outside influences can really come into play. And a good example of that as well is the budgeting process kind of typically happens here simultaneously, where people try to figure out how much this policy change is going to cost and what this looks like, and how much money are we going to spend on that. So obviously that funding and money is going to be a factor here as well. When we move into the policy implementation stage, this is sort of after a policy has passed. And during this time, that's when organizations that are going to are impacted by this are going to be implementing it within their body of work and carrying out this policy. So this might be a state, a local government. It could also, though, be other like nonprofit organizations in the field as well that might have funding, or even on your campus. And so administrators will decide how to deploy the people, how to deploy the money or other resources to support that policy change here. And so as you can imagine, this is also kind of where it gets a little mucky, because policy can be interpretive in many ways. And so it's sort of like when you play the telephone game and you whisper to somebody a sentence or something, and then by the time it's gone through 3-4 people, even sometimes one, whispering that thing, that same thing, it just doesn't wind up being the same thing that the first person said. So this is kind of where it gets a little bit tricky, because people can implement policy in different ways. Also, so that brings us to the last stage here, which is the policy evaluation stage. And this is kind of where we say, okay, as a policymaker, did the policy change do what we wanted it to do? Did it do what actually happened? And we sort of get to a point where sort of assessing, was that successful? And so there's a lot of questions here, right? One, did it work? Two, how do we know that it worked? And how are we measuring that it worked? And so at this point, you'll see think tanks, outside actors, associations, professionals all come in and say, and have some type of feedback to say, listen, we're going to document what's success here. We're going to document the outcome of that. And then do we have to go through the process again? So at a very high level, that's kind of how it works. So a little bit about why you would want to advocate for policy change. So what I want to say right here, really, you all are the change makers. You have the ability to impact and change policy and advocate for policy change. And you guys are the catalyst for change. And so why would you want to change a policy? Well, number one, it might just be an election year and it's time. So that's always kind of a good excuse. And you see a lot of policies change as administrations change over. Also, another time, a lot of people tend to advocate for policy changes because there's a new problem. There's something that really pissed us off, then we need to do something about it. But there also could be an issue with a current policy, and that might be another reason for advocating for policy change. A crisis occurred, and so there's a need for change. We all are in the midst of the pandemic, and that obviously has created a lot of big questions and need for change as well. There's new information about an existing issue, so new research that's done. Also, people's attitudes and belief systems change over time as well, and so that could create a need for policy change. And also, there might be a request for public input, and so oftentimes there could be a deadline to make a change or provide input on public policy. I will encourage you, if you've never participated in your in a public policy general session, they're open sessions, they are open for the public. You can go down to your local government, especially during budget time. You can sign up to speak with your elected officials on the record about something that you care about in particular. You can also do this as well at the state level. So if you're interested in learning more about how this works and just seeing it in action, I definitely encourage you to participate in your process. Let me just check, make sure what time I'm on. Okay, so how do we advocate for policy change? These are some tangible ways that you can advocate for policy change. And so what I want to say is definitely familiarize yourself with your infrastructure on campus, in your community, in your state. This is really, really important. But essentially different things that you can do right now. Number one, facts, right? Use data and research to build your case around what it is that you want to change in a policy. And data and facts really influence people greatly to make a change. When they see numbers, it is staggering, and they feel like, yes, this is something that we need to do. Number two, work together. Right now, we live in such a polarized society. We have to work with people that we don't necessarily agree with to make policy happen. So who in your community sort of holds that perceived power of authority? It's important to recognize who these people are, because they are the influencers in your community. So a good example might be a business that employs a lot of people. It might be the sheriff's office. It might be a school. It might be your campus. So know who those people are and work with them, understand what their priorities are, where their interests lie. Do not let politics get in the way of your partnerships. There is common ground for us to be had. And so I always think about it, the policy making is very much of a team sport. You saw all these people kind of come together to create policy. And so even someone who's might be against your position still might share some similar interest in getting something changed or passed. So always look for what that is in particular. The next is know your audience and tailor your message. And so anything that you're doing, it's important to frame it to the audience that you're speaking to. If you're talking to a lawmaker that cares a lot about the economy or attracting business to their community, then frame it as an economic development perspective and share the economic case to your policy change. Really try as much as you can to be nonpartisan and address what's difficult about it too. I mean, honestly, it's important to know your opposition's argument. And, if there is something that's really difficult or hard to talk about with your policy issue, or the reason why people are against you for that policy issue, well, you need to be able to address that really, really well. So that's important here. And the other thing that's important too is to kind of know your audience, because some people might want you to offer solutions. Some people are not going to be ready for a solution right away. They're going to need to start to talk. They're going to want to focus on talking through the problem itself at first. Organize. There's a lot of different ways that you can bring public awareness to an issue. And so bringing more people and champions on your side is really critical. You can do this through social media campaigns, town halls, writing op-eds, holding a rally, emailing your legislatures. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of do to build that momentum and importance around creating policy change and interest on a particular issue. Storytelling humanizes the issue. And so just as much as data and research is really important, for some people, it's about pulling at the heartstrings. And a lot of people have had some family member, friend, been impacted by an issue themselves, and really understanding how people have been impacted by something that is really, I feel like, is leaps and bounds, is humanizing the issue, will make a huge difference in advocating for your change. So it's important that you're telling the story of people that have been directly impacted by the issue as well, or having them be able to tell the story. Maintain your relationships. So check in even when you don't have an ask sometimes, especially like legislatures or elected officials in general. Only hear from people when there's an ask, and then they do something and they don't know what happened. It is really, really important to just stop in, say hello, and let them know what good has been happening in whatever issue it is that you are working. Don't just like call them up when you need something. Maintaining those relationships are really critical. The other thing I'll say is vote. If you have the ability to vote, look who is on your ballot. Local and state elections, not just during primaries. Read the referendums. These are things that are going to impact you directly. Local government in particular is very close to you from a community perspective. So if you can vote, definitely vote. That is a change that you can make. The other thing is be creative. Think outside the box and try new things. The old way doesn't always mean the right way. I think as students of a future generation, we've seen a lot of policy change and youth-led movements that have worked, and they've been invigorating. And I think like the climate change issue is a good example of how that's come up. There is a lot of possibility for thinking outside the box and doing things in non-traditional ways and being creative. And then Lastly, I want to say is that policy making, it's definitely a marathon, not a race. And you have to really, really be diligent and kind to yourself. Real change is very slow. It's very hard, and there's going to be a lot of setbacks. It's very incremental, and it's that way on purpose for checks and balances. But any social issue, social justice issue in particular, will not change overnight. And the reality is we're not going to see sweeping changes in our lifetimes. And so I know a lot of you are nearing the end of your participation in the Leadership Academy, and some of you might not actually wind up seeing the end of your projects. And the truth is, when you enter in a policy making, policy change, you might not see something at the beginning and you might not see it to the end. You might come in at the middle. And it's really just important to know that anything that you're doing contributes to the change, that contributes to the greater work that's happening. And I don't want you to feel defeated, because this is sort of the natural existence of public policy in general. So this also means that sometimes there's a lot of burnout when you're doing this work. So it is important to take care of yourself. I can really not convey this enough. It could be easily frustrating, but you choose when you get to enter into policy making and policy change and what you want to advocate for. And you can't take care of others if you're not taking care of yourself. So it is really, really important that you're taking a moment for self-care through this entire process, because it can feel defeating at times, especially when there are setbacks. So just to wrap up, I want to say that changes to programs are on a small scale are critically important when you're doing those things. So like increasing access to services, filling gaps, changes to practice. But for large scale change, we really do need to be making changes to our systems and our policies. And so I encourage you to do whatever really is within your bandwidth, whether that is big or small, to create change in your community and on your campuses. The power of this happens at all levels of government. And so we need you at all levels. We need you in the community. We need you on your campus doing this, making this change, and anything that you do, I really just urge you to step into the power that you have for that. I'm going to go ahead and share my information here on the last slide. I know we're going to move forward and share some other examples with you. But if you have any questions, if there's anything that I can do for you, please reach out to me directly. My email is right there on the slide. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. So that was the presentation side of things. What we wanted to do really quick before we leave plenty of time for Q&A, because I know you all probably have some really great questions for Tracy, but we really kind of want to bring this back down to reality. And, what does this actually look like on campus? Because I know many of you who are in the Leadership Academy this year are working to change policies, try to make, even if that comes in the form of not writing down and changing an actual policy in your campus handbook, just changing what the culture looks like on campus. And oftentimes that does involve a lot of the things that Tracy just shared about. So I'm going to share a kind of a story of a past Leadership Academy student and their experience changing policy on their campus. Unfortunately, they weren't able to join tonight, but I just thought it was a really powerful story. And then Matt's also going to share his personal experience with his project in the Leadership Academy last year. So my case study is a student that we had a couple of years ago. I believe it was the 2019 cohort. And for their project, they had a thriving collegiate recovery community on campus, and it had been in existence for years. But for the entirety of its existence, they weren't allowed to be included in the campus tours. So every time a freshman was touring campus with their parents, anytime a transfer student was coming to take a look at campus, anytime there was an orientation or anything like that, the CRC was completely not mentioned. And, it might not have started out that way, kind of like what Tracy was saying about sometimes policies aren't written down. This was just one of those things that it was never, when the CRC started, maybe whoever started the program didn't really prioritize that. And then over the years, it just never happened. Well, by the time that our student was really involved in their collegiate recovery community, they knew that people had been advocating and trying to get this changed on campus. They knew that if students saw the collegiate recovery community, which was right in the center of campus, it was, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was right in their like student union area. If freshmen and anybody who was going to be new to the campus at least knew that they existed, they knew that that was going to be beneficial to brand new students, to at least know that if they ever struggled or if they were coming to school already in recovery, that there was going to be a place for them. And there had been years that people were advocating for it and it just didn't happen. So she took it upon herself this was her impact project. By the end of her time with the Leadership Academy, she wanted to have campus tours including the CRC program. So the first step was finding out who she needed to talk to. So in many cases, a lot of you all are on pretty big campuses. There's a lot of people with decision-making power. There's a lot of people also who have decision-making power, have influence, who you might not think about. So think about faculty members, think about staff members, think about any connections that you might have with administration or anything like that. So the first step in her process of attempting to change this policy was finding out who she needed to talk to. So she ended up, connecting with a couple of her own personal mentors, and her mentors connected her with the person who's in charge of the campus tours. So she ended up scheduling a meeting with that person. And to her surprise, this person was really interested, but the person wanted to learn more. And this person who was in charge wanted her staff to be aware of what this collegiate recovery community was all about as well. So they organized a meeting where our student was able to share more about the CRC, share more about what is a student in recovery? What does that mean? How does this benefit the entire campus? And then after the meeting, obviously it had to go up a couple levels of the chain of command, but within a few weeks, people were really supportive. They were really interested. And she really credited the fact that she was willing to educate in a graceful way. Instead of kind of saying like, I can't believe you don't allow this and kind of pointing fingers, it was really just, hey, like, I really value this. I know that this could be beneficial to our incoming students. And this is why we think it's so important. And by the end of her time with Leadership Academy, her CRC was included in every single campus tour that happened, whether it was a freshman or a transfer student or anybody coming to the campus for the first time. The CRC was also invited to present during the all new student orientation. So they were actually able to send representatives from the collegiate recovery community to share about what it's all about, how you can get involved, and all of that good stuff. So that's just kind of a one example of how you can take all of the things that Tracy was sharing about, which kind of seems like out of reach, maybe, too high level, whatever, but you can really bring some of those practices into your impact projects and to the things that you're doing every day to advocate for some of the things that you're passionate about. If anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to answer if I'm able, but I also want to give Matt the opportunity to share a little bit about his experience changing policies.
Thanks, Hannah. For my CRLA project, what I started out for my impact project is I wanted to get Narcan into all the residence advisors, have all the RAs trained in Narcan, and to keep it like next to the AED, near the first aid. So it's right there and handy. If anything would ever happen. And I developed that ask, and I had a lot of support on campus from like the campus mental health, and we were a new CRC, and we formulated during COVID. So I'd never actually been on campus, but I knew it was a need and it was something that I wanted to do, and I supported harm reduction, and I got turned down, and I think what was really important, what was said, was not to get mad about it and to not, attack, because I wanted to. And then, I changed my ask a little bit, and what ended up happening was we submitted in to do a one-time Narcan training on campus, an event, and have an outside agency, a community provider, come in and provide the Narcan and do the actual training. And there was like, I don't claim to know a lot about student government or policy, but like there were things that we were able to accomplish because we were a small student organization as opposed to an actual program on campus. And I think that that became in as a benefit. But what ended up happening was I went the whole year in the CRLA and I never got that done. We never got the approval until so I switched my project up and I just asked, hey, give me some money for a tablecloth and we'll do a tabling event. And I didn't feel too great about it until like 2 weeks after the retreat. I found out they did approve our event, and we had this great event. We did it at International Overdose Awareness Day last fall. We had like 100 people show up. And what I think really helped when I changed the ask to, Tracy was talking about using research combined with narrative, with storytelling was, you know, as a person in recovery, I was making my plea. And then I was using all the figures. At that time, it was like 80,000 people had died of overdose the last year. And now it's up to 103. And I thought I had a pretty strong argument. What really helped was we had a faculty member come on, and she was associated. She had lost her son to overdose. And then she was affiliated with this group of parents, and these allies and parents that were affected. They came on and they brought banners with people's faces on them, like tons of banners, and we lined the social work rotunda outside, and everybody was affected by that event. It was huge. You know, we distributed 56 boxes of Narcan. And it was just like, it wasn't just the distribution, it was the fact that students came up and they said, like me too, my brother, my uncle, my friend, this just happened, because it is an epidemic, like it is affecting everyone. So after that though, like to bring it all full circle, is last week or earlier this week, we had our student government hearing, or not hearing, like little budget committee hearing. And I filled out the budget for next year's collegiate recovery community. And I think I requested like $250, $300 to do that event again. I wanted to keep doing it annually for International Overdose Awareness Day. And, you know, it was a 5-minute plea you had to do your student budget. And it's funny because after I was done making our appeal for the money for next year's budget, she was like, I only have one question. Why didn't you ask for more money? And I was like, sold. And they gave us $1,000. So now, I mean, hopefully we'll be able to do Narcan trainings like every month, or at least more often. And it broke that seal, because Tracy mentioned like the policy, it wasn't written down because nobody had ever asked before. So now we've kind of made a good impression, I think, and built a good reputation. And I still talk to those people, not just because I need things, but the dean and the provost and the president. I have a working relationship with them, and they know who I am. Maybe that's the hair, they recognize me, I don't know, but they always say hi to me on campus. So I mean, it worked out. Like I said, they gave us an extra $750 next year. So I think that's my experience with policy. So I will turn it back over to Tracy, or you want me to ask questions now, Hannah?
Yeah, I think now would be a great time to just jump into some Q&A. So if anybody has questions for Tracy, I believe we have the Q&A box set up. So that's probably the most efficient way to ask questions, is just throw it in the Q&A box down there, and then we'll just kind of go in order.
I saw Robin put one in the chat. She said, I heard new bills are thrown out every 2 years. So if you can't get it done in that time frame, then you have to resubmit every 2 years. Is that true?
So yeah, this is sort of what happens at the congressional level. And so a Congress is an elected body that's in place in a 2-year, as they stand in a 2-year period. So if a bill does effectively die before it becomes a law, it can be actually reintroduced under the new Congress. So I would say, from this perspective, there's a lot of information on how bills ultimately become law. Law supersedes policy. And so I always refer back to this old Schoolhouse Rock video on how a bill becomes a law. It's super outdated, but I can drop it in the chat. It's, I think, still a really great depiction of how the process works at the federal level.
Is that the I'm just a bill? Here on Capitol Hill. You go, Tracy. That's right. I remember that.
It's still so relevant,
Uh,
know?
Always.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll Google and put it up for you.
Sweet. Somebody else put into the chat, they said, if a policy isn't written down, can I get in trouble if I violate it?
Yes, do not break the law. But there are policy loopholes, I would say. Sometimes things are not written down. And so just because you found a policy loophole doesn't mean that it's a yes. But it also doesn't mean that it's a no. And sometimes those gaps, again, it's about the interpretation of the policy. So it depends on who you're working with. It doesn't necessarily mean a yes, but there are loopholes in policy because every policy is interpreted differently by different people.
That's a great example of that is in Fort Lauderdale, there's a paraphernalia law that technically applies to fentanyl testing strips and Narcan, even if they wanted to go that far. But there's been sit downs with the sheriff and the local community leaders that say that they're not going to enforce that law. So even though it's stepping back, like I guess if they really wanted to, but they've come out with policy to kind of get around. Or would that be a practice instead of a policy?
So again, like not every policy is always really clear and can be interpreted in different ways. And so policy change is really hard to do. Sometimes it is a lot easier to actually change a practice than it is changing a full-blown written down policy. And so sometimes that's just more feasible. And I will say it gives a little bit more flexibility when you're interpreting the policy if you're able to just easily change a practice. But sometimes that's not always the case, depending on who you're working with, what organization that you're working with or working under, what the policy is. There might need to be some clarification.
Okay. Well, that brings us to our next question. Nikki says, regarding interpretation, when the policies are not clear, who's the best person to go to, or where do you turn?
So it kind of depends, right? On campus, I would say that's probably a question that's better suited for Hannah. I would say probably your administration or the student governance body. Hannah, am I right there? I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, depending on how high up you want to go, I think checking with, if you have a CRC, checking with your CRC coordinator, if you have maybe a staff member that you're close with, or even a faculty member that you're close with, just trying to get their input first. And then, if you have any connections with administrators, you can go right to them, but they also might not know, like we have all these unwritten rules where people are kind of like, yeah, this is just how things have always been done, kind of how Tracy was talking about. So I think it would be best to just kind of check with somebody that you're close with and maybe have them look into it for you. And then hopefully they can connect you with the right person. But in terms of, at the community level, Tracy, do you have any feedback about that?
Again, it sort of depends on what the issue is and what you're working on. For me, I'm working right now. There's something that's impacting me personally that I really would like to see changed, and I don't understand the issue fully. And so I've really been probing and asking a lot of questions about the issue. I've been asking questions from professionals in the field. I've been asking questions from people that run organizations and other people that have been impacted to understand why hasn't this been changed? And sometimes there is some reason around that, or there's a hesitancy of why something hasn't been changed. That's really important stuff that I need to know before I would take it up and go any further with advocating for what I want to see changed ultimately. So that's kind of, I'm working in a space right now where I'm not well-versed as a subject matter expert on the topic. And that's kind of how I'm going about it, is just asking a lot of questions to understand why the policy is the way it is, and that if the solution makes sense. or at least the way that I think the solution should be makes sense. In some cases, it might be a government official that you go to. If there's an elected body, they serve their constituents. So if you um, have questions about something, you can email that person. You can email like your commission board or whoever is your elected body of whoever is your district supervisor or commissioner. The terminology does vary from state to state who that person is, but you can email them. They have staff, and you can, if you have a problem with something in your community, that's what they're there for. So you can ask those questions.
Nice. We've got another question. When trying to enact a new policy, how important is it to know the history of the current law or policy, previous attempts at changing this policy, etc.? And they also said, in addition to that previous question, how important is it to get community or opposing viewpoints before bringing policy change to the powers that be?
Yeah, so all of those things. I think it is important to understand the history of why a policy is in place to begin with and all of the attempts that have been made. This happens so much in community work, where something feels like a lot of community coalitions will come together and have so many starts and stops on an issue. And because that's usually because they're tackling this huge issue and not biting off small chunks, or it's because they they don't understand the history and they're trying to enact something that's already been started or stopped and finished. And then people will say, well, though we've already tried that. And you'll say, well, you know what? It's a new time. We're going to try it again. Let's do something different. And understanding what has been done in the past is really important. And sometimes the time is just right for change. Again, there's new information, new research, new data. Sometimes there's a new political body that might have a vested interest and actually support a change. And so things are constantly evolving in our world, and it is important that we are going in with all of the information. Same thing with the opposing viewpoint. You can't be an effective advocate if you don't know what the opposite side is saying that refutes your policy position or that issue. And being prepared and having a good response for those things to sort of demonstrate why this change is so important is what makes you really effective at advocating for policy change.
Can't do enough research. Yep.
No.
This one's for me. Martha May Tucker says, Matt, your event was epic. For the creation of a CRP, CRC, what are the best steps to identify people, students and faculty, staff and parental, and garner public support to create the organization so that policy change can start? My situation is kind of unique in that I was identified by the dean. Because I have a criminal record, I had to have a big meeting with her before they would let me into the school. And she selected me and two other students to she kind of voluntold us to create a CRP. She came from a different, she was new. She came from a different college that already had one. So I was lucky. But what helped even more than that was a safe project. We were kind of like shooting in the dark there, and it was COVID and I didn't know what I was doing, but I was also simultaneously enrolled in the CRLA. And we had our summit and then the retreat. And throughout that, I got to hear from other students what their schools were doing. Some schools were big. Some schools were just 3 or 4 people like my school. Some were CRPs, CRCs. I learned the lingo. And that's how I met a lot of the people that came to our event, like Tom Bennett, a guy who does help students to get out of school to go to treatment and then come back. I didn't know there was a comeback part. That was really like unique and nice to learn. So I don't think you can make enough connections or learn enough. Like we just said, research. And that's a crazy thing, because with the dean identifying me, it worked out really great So I can understand the benefits to like that box on an application. Whereas I'm still an avid member of Ban the Box, a political organization, removed the question about criminal history from the college application as a barrier to education. So the issues are really complex and in depth. So
And those relationships, Matt, are so key because you don't know. No one is really an enemy, right? Like I said, it's a team sport. So you don't know who you're going to need on your side in the future, and where you might be working together with someone unexpected. I always say that sometimes we call people non-traditional partners, and then that kind of makes them in that non-traditional space. It's like an unexpected partner. The truth is that everyone's partners, and that is definitely something that is so needed in the policy space. Is we just have to come together and work with people that we might not have expected to work with to make something happen.
definitely. Oh, here's one. How do you approach policy change that's enmeshed in cultural norms? For example, condom distribution or sexual education in a predominantly religious community. Ooh.
Yeah, that's really hard. I've seen a lot of success personally, through um, like using faith leaders. Faith leaders are very great partners in a community, and a lot of people really lean on their faith community and go to their faith leaders and trust their faith leaders, and sometimes don't trust the government. And so even difficult conversations where you might not expect a faith leader to be on your side, when it comes to things like harm reduction in particular, can be great champions for the work that you're doing, and a real great connection to breaking through to the communities that they are able to reach in a way that like governments or people in positions of perceived power and authorities in communities might not be.
All right, I think that was actually our last question in the boxes. So if anybody does have additional questions after we leave here tonight, or if you're rewatching the recording at any point, Tracey did share her information, and you will get a copy of that in the email that I follow up with as well. So feel free to reach out to her or Matt and I if you do have any questions or anything that you'd like to chat about more afterwards.